Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is a session from Just Lead Washington. My name is Omid Bagari Garikani. I'm joined by KJ Williams, who will be speaking after me. And what we want to talk with you all today is about what does it mean to have equitable client interactions and what is the historical and political context that we need to understand race equity, structural racism, and the role of race. In terms of how we go about our work, how we go about our advocacy, how we go about any of our interactions with those around us, but particularly we're going to focus in and work our way towards how to ensure we are interacting equitably with those in front of us, those who are really working through the behavior of these systems, the clients. So first, I just want to acknowledge the land we are on. We are on stolen and occupied land. I make this acknowledgement of the indigenous land that we are on, not only because it is relevant for our conversation today about in terms of the role of race and racism and equity, but in terms of the different barriers that people are facing today and the type of inequities that we do see in the data. We need to understand that none of these things are coincidences, and so we know that there is a disproportionate impact on indigenous communities. We know that, as this image is moving in front of you, in terms of the land that was forcefully taken from sovereign tribal nations, the wealth, in terms of us operating in this capitalistic society, the wealth that was forcibly taken away as well, and then we see so much economic insecurity in predominantly low-income communities, indigenous communities, Black communities, and other communities of color. If you don't know which land, whose land you are on, I highly recommend wherever you are in the state of Washington to check out this website, native-land.ca, to explore and learn specifically about the tribe whose land you are on, that you live and work on. I am in Seattle, and so acknowledge the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish, for allowing me to live and work on their land. And I thank them for allowing me to be here. I encourage folks to learn about whose land they're on and figure out ways to directly support them, and learn about how you can advocate for the work that indigenous communities have been doing in their communities and have been moving towards, especially in these times of COVID. So today's session, we have three main goals. I'm going to speak to goals 1 and 2, and to tee up KJ speaking to goals 3. So I'm going to provide an overview of key concepts in terms of some fundamental definitions, equity, structural racism, implicit bias, and so forth. I'm going to draw some key connections between racism, poverty, and other societal systems needed for health, and bring a health context to these conversations as well. I am not a lawyer by training. I am a public health worker focused on health policy and equity. But when we look at how the housing system operates, and then the downstream effect of evictions, when we look at unemployment and the system of economic development around it, we start to see how these are specific patterns of racialization that we can identify. And my primary message that I want to speak with you all today are, how can we get better at identifying those patterns so we can disrupt them, counter them, and interrupt them while they're happening in the moment, to build our agility and capacity to intervene in anti-racist ways. This is what I really want to speak to you all at. And we're going to go through some history to be able to understand that the role of structural racism on the systems that we work with and are a part of. They operate in consistent ways and create consistent patterns, and this is why we see racial inequities across every quality of life indicator. And lastly, after all of this, we're going to pass it off to KJ to talk a little more about how does this conversation play out interpersonally when you are with a client in terms of applying this understanding of race equity, this understanding of the history to ensure there are equitable interactions, and you are doing all that you can to work with your client in the ways that they really need. So, in terms of the legal problems that we see, I just want to, lift up again. I'm not going to go into details on this study, but in terms of the prevalence of legal problems that we see across different racial groups, again, this is just another piece of how the patterns of racism are consistently seen across every sector. And so, the Civil Legal Needs Study, 2015, indicating yet again that Indigenous people, Black and Brown communities, Latinx folks, they have more legal problems, and they are also least likely to have their legal needs met, right? And that's whether it's in healthcare, in employment, rental housing, education, and so forth. So, this is part of the pattern, and this is what we want to be able to connect the dots on to kind of build up our analysis and orient ourselves to the reality that folks who are dealing with legal problems are operating within. And so part of this comes to a conversation around, what is equity? Equity and equality. Folks probably have seen different visuals like this one. What I really want to highlight is the grass, the lawn that these three people who are standing on top of different amounts of boxes that are standing on. It's not that, it's not only that they need different things to be able to see over the fence, but they're also not beginning on a level playing field. And this is where we really can understand how systemically there are racialized barriers that are continuing to then create the same disparities by race and harm from any system that we can point to. And so, this is the difference between essentially equity and equality. And, again, what we're really working towards is to ensure that we can break down those systemic barriers, that we can tear down the fence. And so all folks can have easier pathways to kind of meet the self-determination and agency of how they want to live their lives and have the mobility to choose, which, in our economic environment, particularly with housing stability and so forth, oftentimes there are just little to no options around. So, thinking about this on a community level, because we're going to talk about that, this is understanding that, equity is about addressing the multi-generational accumulation of wealth and resources in some communities over others. And in the case of when we're talking about racism, we're talking about less resources in Black and Brown communities, Indigenous communities, and other communities of color. Historically, for centuries, for generations, and so when we're understanding about how we can shift resource, how we can shift power, this has to be a part of the conversations, because equality would only mean that we provide everyone the same resources under the assumption that the status quo will lead to the positive outcomes that we all want. But again, if we look at the data, we know that that's not true. The status quo does not do that. So we can actually see that the status quo is harmful. So when I say racial equity, just to provide a simple definition, talking about the point where race no longer determines one's outcomes. Along with this point of equity that we're working towards, it requires that as we're working towards that state of racial equity, that we are not only dismantling what does not work and what is creating these racist harms and racial inequities, but that we're also building up systems that will ensure the outcomes we want. And then once we reach that point, how are we proactively reinforcing policies and practices? How are we ensuring the attitudes and actions are there to produce equitable power, access, opportunities, so we can reach those positive impacts and outcomes for all. So, race equity is what we want to work towards, but we need to be cognizant of the actors and the systems that create inequities, and ensuring that we are building instead something that will actually reach that point of racial equity and also allow all of us to collectively reinforce it with our behavior, with our actions, and how our systems operate. So levels of equity work. So far, I've been talking a lot about the structural systemic level. This is a layout of several different levels. The largest circle here on the left is that structural systemic, and then it kind of moves down all the way to interpersonal, individual, internal, and subconscious. So that blue blob right there on the right, that's actually an aerial shot of a brain, because we are going to talk about implicit biases today. But I share this visual to say that these are different levels. They are all connected. You can't talk about one level of work without talking about the other. And it's helpful to think about these levels sometimes, because oftentimes it can be a way we are kind of speaking past someone in terms of what issue they are particularly speaking to. So for example, if I were to say the law and justice system is racist, I would be really speaking to the racialization, the entrenched racism that the legal system has built up over generations, over centuries, since the beginning of this country. Now, if KJ heard that and responded with, "Well, I'm not racist. I'm a part of this system," well, they would be responding more on an interpersonal level. Both of those conversations are valid. Both of those conversations we should be having in terms of the racism that is perpetuated on a structural level versus the racism that is perpetuated on the individual interpersonal level. But if two people are speaking on those two different levels, then the conversation is going to continue to go sideways. And so it's important to be cognizant of, which level are we speaking to, and to also understand that how all of these things kind of interplay with each other, which we're going to speak to a little bit, because what's happening on the micro level is going to reflect on the macro, and vice versa. So as we move through our session today, we're going to get more and more specific and close to the interpersonal individual level. So a question that I will share with you all today, just to think about, just to kind of orient yourself to our conversation today, and something for you to think about on your own, with others you work with, and so forth, is, how does an intentional focus on equity and anti-racism benefit my work with clients? This is a key question to ensure that we are proactively and intentionally thinking about how this work interplays. And we're going to talk about, the importance of being deliberate and intentional. But this is a question, if it's not something you've already thought about, to reflect on, because there are a lot of aspects of the work, inequities that need to be addressed, and each of us have decision power, control over certain situations. So it's thinking about, okay, how does this benefit what I can do, what I have control over? And that's really important, and it can ensure that we are doing what we can, and ensuring that we are supporting other efforts as well. But just to really to understand that when we think about how the why and how relevant all these things are, there's no shortage of headlines, especially in these COVID-19 times, in terms of the harms of racism and the racial and health impact. These headlines, the devastating toll on Black Americans, Latinx Americans, the impact on indigenous communities, anti-Asian racism and xenophobia. These headlines, again, are part of these consistent patterns, and we can contextualize them and understand them with what we know about what structural racism is and isn't. So here's one that is particularly relevant in terms of the economic inequality we are seeing, in terms of how the unemployment rates are changing, how the impact of evictions are going to be playing out on communities. And so you understand that, Black workers in particular are dealing with structural racism as they have always been. Latinx workers have been dealing with structural racism as they always have been, and now they are dealing with the economic, the exacerbation of the economic inequality that was already there by COVID-19. Again, a continuation of these same patterns. So when I say structural racism, what I'm speaking to is I'm referring to the ways that all institutions work together to produce racialized outcomes, and ultimately how we see all these racial inequities in all these headlines. This is all to say that structures matter. They are not neutral. Every system unevenly distributes benefits, burdens, violence, and power, and we can always see it moving in one direction. It is a bias for white people and whiteness, and at the expense of bias against Black, Indigenous, and people of color. In a United States context, this is the pattern of racism that we can see in every set of data and headlines, and what we can start to look for and examine. And again, the work here is to better be able to identify these patterns when they're playing out, so we can, in the moment, better be able to counter them, interrupt them, disrupt those patterns, and intervene in anti-racist ways. So structural racism, it's structural, it's institutionalized, it's cultural, and it's internalized in terms of how they affect our implicit biases. It is not biology, it is not racial slurs, it is not good or bad intentions. And what I mean by that is, if we took, the overt, quote unquote, overt racist, KKK, Klansmen, all those folks, rounded them up, shipped them out, shipped them off, sent them to the moon, what have you, all the people with, quote unquote, bad intentions, we would still have structural racism, systemic institutionalized racism in place. Well, the work we are doing, what we are talking about, is how racism can be perpetuated through these systems, and how we all can perpetuate those racial inequities from continuing, despite good and bad intentions, despite the fact that we would never use racial slurs or what have you. This is not to say that there is not explicit acts of racism that need to be addressed and called out, especially nowadays with our white supremacists in chief. And the work that we must do is understand how racism is racially coded, and will be less overt, and this is how it has been able to continue and stay alive and keep adapting through in different ways through the systems that we are part of and work with. And I also say it's not biology, because that's really key and important. Race used to be deemed in textbooks as a biologically determined, genetic factor, yet what we know is that there is nothing in terms of the genetics that explains race. What we're actually speaking to is racism. Racism is the problem. Race is not the problem. So for example, in terms of COVID-19, we had a similar conversation to understand why was there a disproportionate impact in the Black community. Well, it wasn't because of individual behavior, it wasn't because of genetics, it is because of the high exposure of structural racism to the Black community, to communities of color, that has allowed those disproportionate impacts to play out as they have, and for us to see this this huge disparity in health in response to COVID-19 and across everything else. So all to say that, you know, there's nothing inequitable to my health being a person of color. There's nothing that increases my risk of eviction or unemployment because I am a person of color. However, my chance of eviction, my chance of unemployment does increase by being a person of color living in the United States because I am in a racialized environment, because I'm being exposed to racism, not simply being a person of color, but being one that lives in the United States and operating within this environment of structured racism. It's what's going to bring those outcomes to be more likely. So there's a lot of reasons for this. We want to talk a little bit about the neighborhood housing level, and we want to talk a little bit about unemployment as well. So, you know, when we talk about residential segregation, racial segregation, folks are familiar with the practice of redlining, you know, in terms of specifically through the, you know, denial of loans and so forth, providing mortgages to folks to secure homes in particular neighborhoods, with the aim to create all white neighborhoods and to ensure that Black people, communities of color, could not live in these neighborhoods. One thing I want to lift up is, you know, redlining became institutionalized because it was already happening in different ways, but it was institutionalized when the now U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development was first erected. And I point that out because all of the systems that we operate with were first erected in times where there was explicit white supremacy and overt racism. And again, you know, our work now is to determine how these things are racially coded. But when we look at the impact of redlining, we can see that neighborhoods still mimic that same racial segregation. You know, how neighborhoods are structured, the effects of these policies often create very they're stable. They're over time. And this was, you know, bolstered by things like racial covenants, you know, white only clauses on house deeds to ensure only white people own particular property. All of these things affect health. And so, you know, when we talk about redlining, this isn't just something that happened in the South or Jim Crow era, which is often what people think. This is something that happened across the country, up and down the West Coast and across Washington State. So these are redlining maps, for example, from you know, a few different cities. This resource at the bottom, Mapping Inequality, is a great Google Maps interface that shows redlining maps from across the country. And of course, we see Tacoma, Spokane, and Seattle here on the bottom. Racial covenants, here are two examples. If you haven't seen the exact language from Spokane County and Whatcom County, specifically saying that the white race is the only race that is allowed to own, you know, this property, this land, you know, indigenous land at that, except for a domestic servant who may be someone who's not white, not of the white race, but only if they are hired by that white owner. So, you know, there's a health impact, and today for these practices of redlining and all sorts of policies that enforce racial segregation. You know, it influences health by concentrating poverty and environmental pollutants in some neighborhoods over others, because, you know, those pollutants, any infectious agents or adverse conditions we could cite, they weren't going to the white neighborhoods. They were being relegated to the undesirable, hazardous neighborhoods. We see the increase then of the risk of cancer. We see a harmful association between the segregation and mortality rates across infants and adults. And in one analysis, we that estimated that segregation was responsible for 176,000 deaths annually, right? And again, this is how things are playing out today. This is the health impact of racial segregation. And this is the context that we're operating in and our clients are operating within. So it's no surprise when we see headlines like this. Why white school districts have so much more money, $23 billion, more funding goes to school districts that serve predominantly white students compared with districts that serve mostly students of color. When we understand how racial segregation also created a huge disparity in resources, like I said, the multi-generational accumulation of resources in some communities over others, we see that the education system in what are known to be, Black neighborhoods, Black and brown neighborhoods, Asian neighborhoods, communities of color, we see huge disparity in resources, and today we see that amount to billions of dollars in funding going to white school districts, essentially over other school districts that serve mostly students of color. So when we think about the role the legal system plays, 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, a huge, important milestone case that was necessary. But if we were to ask today, did we reach educational equity? We would all have to be able to answer that question with a no. And we have to understand why that's a no. It's because of headlines like this. When we start looking at the ways housing is looking today, we're going to talk a little bit about some data in terms of tenants. We're going to talk about home ownership and how that relates to wealth. Just overview these things briefly to understand, again, when we talk about the risk of eviction, why we see the numbers that we see. So, for example, 2.2 million households, over 5 million people are low income and participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, Section 8. 62% of those folks are people of color, right? That's a huge disparity. And then, you throw on top of that to understand and learn how Section 8 voucher holders, people with disabilities as well, and when those two things are compounded, the harm is even greater, that are frequently discriminated against or denied housing by landlords on top of that. So when you think about who doesn't own homes and who is not, and also struggling, and also on Section 8, and who is also being discriminated against for using these programs to really ensure housing stability and health for themselves and their families, we see all of these things being compounded, and again, part of the patterns. And this graph here on the right is just to point out that non-discrimination laws are helpful and do decrease the rejections from landlords for those who are using Section 8 housing vouchers, and also that they still persist. And so this is just to keep in mind that despite fair housing laws, that we still see structural racism still playing out, and that is important for us in terms of still looking and identifying those patterns and what our orientation is to these issues. When you look at home ownership, we see that 1.6 times as many white households in the U.S. are homeowners compared to households of color. And that number for Washington State is 1.46 times, right? And we see the home ownership rates are huge disparities across different groups, both nationally and in Washington State. And so, what's the pattern here? It's like, well, landlords are, in the end, disproportionately white. They have increased wealth because of that home ownership, and they have the backing of a racialized system, to intentionally or unintentionally marginalize tenants who are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so, again, you see this context play out. And then this is a recent headline just recently about the home ownership gap between white and Black Americans. This is even higher now than in the 1960s. And so you think about all the changes and policy efforts that have been made over the decades, in understanding, what was missing from our orientation, our analysis, to allow now the homeownership gap to be even higher than in the 1960s. So this invites us to think about what might we be doing wrong, what can we do differently to actually reach these outcomes that we all want. So it's no surprise when we see headlines like women of color living in poverty face highest risk of eviction. In Washington State, in particular, Black women and Black families are at the highest risk of eviction. And we see again these same disparities and paying more for rent, especially in white neighborhoods. And we see it in other systems too, like the unemployment system. We see it in the healthcare system in terms of how Medicaid program was set up as well. So unemployment rates, these different lines here, is top line being the Black communities, Hispanic, Asian, and white communities, and we see this disparity running through and through. And of course, right here in 2020, as some of you are intimately familiar with, we see this huge increase in unemployment rates. Again, the same pattern. When we look at the white unemployment rate and the Black unemployment rate in 10 cities that were first to uprise after the killing of George Floyd at the hands of law enforcement, the top here being Minneapolis, you see 1.9% white unemployment rate and 8% Black unemployment rate in Minneapolis. And all the way down to Seattle, they're at 2.1 and 4% between white and Black unemployment rates. To understand these patterns is to understand how systems of unemployment interplay with the system of policing and how that plays with system of housing and education. This is us building an analysis of structural racism to understand how all of these systems operate in ways that produce these racial inequities when all of these things are compounded on top of one another. I want to point out wage theft for a moment, just because, in terms of this huge spike in unemployment rates that we're seeing, and increase in unemployment insurance claims, and those are people who were able to make the claims, or people who have the resources, the know-how, the ability to navigate these systems, which in of itself is going to have barriers. But when we talk about wage theft, what we mean is the unlawful practice of not compensating workers for all of their labor. So folks, generally speaking, are familiar with this framing in terms of thinking about when workers are underpaid, when their overtime is not met, or various other reasons where they're not fully compensated for their labor. And when we see the data, we see studies and research that indicates that this, again, disproportionately impacts Black people, people of color, as well as young workers, women, immigrant workers. And these groups are also more likely to be paid less than minimum wage, more likely, in other words, to be in low wage jobs. And in 2014, one study estimated that $50 billion per year is taken from workers, right? And by comparison, the total value of all robberies, burglaries, larceny, and motor vehicle theft in the U.S. in 2015 was 12.7 billion. So this idea of folks working to be truly compensated for their labor in already a system that does not protect workers, that does not protect essential workers, workers who are, in our COVID-19 time are only essential by name, but not in economic support that they deserve. We can, again, build our analysis on what wage theft actually is in this case. And those of us dealing with, unemployment insurance claims can understand and use this context to approach our work with this understanding of how our systems operate. Unemployment also means that with low wages means a thin wealth cushion. So as this economic impact of COVID-19 is continuing to be felt, those who have already lower wages, who are likely to be underpaid, who are underpaid, and so forth, they're going to have less of a buffer, less of an ability to weather that economic impact. And anytime you look at any national emergency, any economic recession, any pandemic, we are not only going to see similar racial disproportionality, because that's how our system operates, and not just racial disproportionality, but disproportionalities across gender, sexual orientation, and ability in particular. We're going to see these things play out, and we're going to see, you know, the ability to accumulate wealth over generations to play a undermining role in folks being able to weather that storm. And so, you know, this median household net worth here, again, huge disparity between households of color, white households in particular, with Latinx and Black households. So if we look at wealth by race over the years, we can see just in a slightly different visual here, again, those same inequities. And I want to point out that this top blue line here is white. This line only has a Black and Latinx households, so it doesn't include, you know, Asian households. They're not you know, and if we had Asian households, we'd also want to make sure it was disaggregated as well, to, you know, kind of reveal the difference of experience within the Asian community. But when we're looking at this graph, we see this huge difference, and we see this big drop. If anyone was noticing that big drop there, that was the 2008 recession, and we saw this huge drop in wealth in white households. But of course, since 1983, we have seen the wealth in Black and Latinx households to be consistently low. So even in this 08 recession, it was a recession. We called it a recession because it impacted white communities. And we responded in ways to bolster the economy to support essentially white households. But we are not approaching this huge drop in wealth or this consistent these consistent low numbers in household wealth, median household wealth, in the same ways for Black and brown communities and communities of color. And this is how, again, this is the racism that, when left unchecked, is just going to continue to produce patterns of racial inequities. And, you know, we should not be surprised to see these patterns continue if we're not willing to do something different, if we're not willing to truly approach our work differently. So this is all to say that the law is not neutral. In fact, neutral is harmful. When you receive your case, when you receive, you know, your unemployment, evictions case, what have you, you're also receiving the political, social, and historical context of systemic marginalization. And so what we've been doing so far is we've been thinking about systems. We've been kind of applying that mindset. And now I want to talk a little bit about, and I want you to think about, what are the choice points that you have? What are the decision-making opportunities that you have, that your team has, that your organization has? Because these are areas where we can intervene in anti-racist ways when we see those patterns of racism play out, which we now discuss are extremely likely and arguably, I would say, guaranteed to play out in front of us. So the goal here is to disrupt, interrupt, and counter racialized dynamics and the power arrangements in our work. You know, choice points are an opportunity to implement anti-racist interventions. This is what we want to work towards, and do so together, collectively, because the cumulative impacts of these many, what seemingly might be small choices, can be just as significant as the impacts of large choices, big decisions. And of course, if we scale that out, if we're all collectively doing that and thinking in anti-racist ways and practicing anti-racism in our work, then we can slowly move the needle. Now, all of this is dependent on our ability to interrogate our racial biases, and to self-study. Self-study is understanding the data, it's understanding the history and why everything we are seeing today is not a coincidence. We can build our analysis of racism, structural racism, institutionalized racism. That's going to allow us to broaden our purview and engage with people in situations differently. So, you know, us being able to become more able and agile to disrupt, interrupt, and counter is going to be simultaneously doing the personal work that we have to do, interrogating our racial biases, and doing our homework. We have to self-study. So I want to do a little bit of that with you, and I encourage you to do continue to do that on your own and with others that you work with. So when we think about choice points, we want to think about, okay, well, what is the first decision that you need to make? In the typical life of a case, what is the first decision that you need to make? So, in terms of unemployment insurance case, and that appeal process begins when evictions, the moratoria is lifted and evictions are increasing. When you receive this case, just think of the decisions, and if you can, the first decision that you need to make when you first receive that case. And think of as many as you can. If we were back and forth right now, I would be getting folks to share their questions, and we could talk about some of them. But the idea here is we want to be able to think about decisions and explore how these structural patterns of racism that we're talking about, how might they be playing out on us and in interactions that we are exploring. And KJ is going to speak to that as well. In a previous session, on this question, one person shared the question, something that they think of when they receive their case is my client credible? And I thought that was a really interesting question and a useful one to talk about, because this idea of is my client credible is deeply racialized in terms of understanding the stereotypes and associations that we have put on people of color, Black and brown communities, and in some cases specifically, Black women, Indigenous women, women of color, in terms of their credibility, right? So you can quickly understand how when you think of different biases you might have, you might be more likely to assume this person is more credible. You might have a bias to assume and provide more empathy for a certain situation, when really what we need to be thinking about is if we are applying our race equity analysis, and we are understanding that this isn't about individual behavior, this is about the harms of systems, and when we receive that case, we are looking at ways to mitigate that harm, guide our client in ways that can mitigate that harm and minimize that harm, and hopefully reach the goals that they want, and do our best to facilitate that. But the systems are going to operate. This isn't about individual behavior at the end of the day. And there are things that we can talk about in order to guide people through those systems as well. So, the final question is, of all these choice points that you are thinking about with your client, where could racialization occur? Well, the short answer to that is all of them. And that's what we want to be thinking about. Because again, neutral is harmful, status quo is harmful. So not thinking about these things, not intentionally, proactively having this analysis and applying it to the situations we're in is likely to just perpetuate the status quo, which is harmful in a racially coded way. It is harmful. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these biases. I mentioned that a few times, and this is going to be the last thing I talk about before I hand it off to KJ. Project Implicit is the name of the research study that came out with the Implicit Association Test, IAT. I encourage each of you to take one or several. If you have not taken one before, if you just search Implicit Association Test on tests on Google, you'll find the website, and they have countless tests that can provide you a data point on yourself. This isn't an end-all be-all test, but it can share a little bit about where you are at in your biases across different groups and categories of race and gender and left-handed, right-handed bias and so forth. All of this to say that This research study was conclusive on several things that's going to help us on the remaining pieces I want to speak with you all today, which is, implicit biases are pervasive. They predict behavior. They differ between people, and that's because of different lived experiences, different upbringing, different childhoods, different neighborhoods we grew up in. If you live in the United States at any point in history, and in some cases, some specific neighborhoods, you lived in a racially segregated environment. So it was by design that you wouldn't see certain people in your neighborhood. And all of these things is the environmental stimuli that's going to infuse our subconscious and our biases, which I'm going to speak more about. And lastly, one thing that came out of this study was, if you are unaware of your implicit biases, you are more likely to act them out. And this is why we talk so much about being aware, proactively, intentionally thinking about them, because the more likely we are to be aware of them, the more we can ensure they don't affect our decision making. We can minimize their effect on our decision making. So with this study and in many other studies that have come since that, if we can accept implicit biases exist, if we can accept, these big pieces of science that we've been able to wrap our minds around, brain science, then we must explore how these dynamics are showing up in our relationships, personally and professionally. So, our brains process 11 million bits of information at any given moment, but at best, we're only consciously aware of 40 bits of that 11 million. And so largely we operate in our system one thinking: unconscious, automatic, fast, effortless. This is an evolutionary thing that we as humans do to process all of the information that we get from the world around us, and be able to move about it from childhood till now in ways that doesn't require a lot of thinking each time. If you can imagine any day where you've had to think a lot about everything, that is tiring. But this is a really critical understanding we need to have, because we do need to slow down, be conscious, and be deliberate and effortful to engage our system to thinking. This is the consciousness raising that we need to have to interrupt our biases from playing out in our decision making. Now, of course, bias is not always bad. It's not always a negative thing. I grew up in a household that drank a lot of tea, so I have a bias for tea over coffee, although I still like coffee, but tea is better. Harmful, not a harmful bias. But when you apply these things to systemic oppression, to issues of systemic harm and equity, then we can see how this equation would be extremely harmful, in particular when we are in positions and controlling the flow of information and resources. So, where all these biases might come from, these schemas, as we might call them, this is how a person thinks about social categories based on our lived experience. So they come from our parents, our families, friends, media. They have positive or negative associations. They start when we're young, they strengthen over time, become more and more automatic. So it can be as simple as the blue is green. This is what a dog looks like. If you were to draw like some stick figures, all of these things, when we can quickly think of them, is because of these schemas. This is where our implicit social cognitions come from. But again, we want to talk about this in the context of race and racism. So how then our racial biases play out is how we internalize racism. And what internalized racism is unconsciously making racist attitudes and behavior part of our nature that affect our decision making, our impact on others, and perception of ourselves. So if earlier we were talking about structural racism and how it is the consistent pattern is a bias for white people and whiteness and a bias against Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, and what we are seeing here is the internalization of that bias. And so we're then going to internalize, that white is right, and and that there is more than qualities associated with whiteness and white people, and there's going to be less than quote unquote qualities associated with communities of color. So associations we have with different words ultimately can infuse into our decision making, and then we start, and they're based on racist attitudes and stereotypes that are culturally passed on and perpetuated in our environments, in our media, and so forth. Then we are defining someone based on what is coming up for us subconsciously, rather than engaging with them and letting them to define themselves for us, because that's the work we want to do to ensure that we are not making assumptions and that we are not projecting our biases onto other people, because that's ultimately going to be harmful and be a continuation of these patterns. So my time is coming to an end here, and I just want to share, I shared a little bit about culture, and this is really important, and I want to end with it. Professor John Powell speaks to this framework of the circle of human concern, and I want to end with this because when we're talking about our biases, when we're talking about now this interpersonal, individual, and subconscious level of our levels of equity, we are talking about how our policies and practices, how our system is set up, what it means to live in a race-constructed society, is creating a sense of belonging for some groups over others, in particular for whiteness and white people over Black, Indigenous communities of color. And we can say this conclusively because of the racial inequities, the patterns that we talked about, that we can consistently see. And so we know that there's an exclusion there. And it's important to talk about culture in this way, because ultimately what we have in this circle of human concern is white supremacy. It's this idea that the dominant cultural force in the United States operates in ways that leads to these inequitable policies and practices that will marginalize, Black and brown communities, Indigenous communities, communities of color, people with disabilities, folks in the LGBTQIA community, and so forth. What we're talking about is how there is an oppression by dominant white culture. And so there's a lot here that we can continue to talk about, but again, the primary piece I want to talk about is what are those dominant cultural forces that are allowing these biases that we have across race to persist, and how are they ultimately leading to the perpetuation of policies and practices that create these racial inequities and harm for so many. This work, is about how we as individuals can expand our capacity to identify, disrupt, and counteract racialized patterns, interrupting our own internalized biases before it affects our decision makings. We want to go below the surface to do that personal work, to do that self-study. This is that historical, political context of systemic marginalization that you're also receiving when you receive your case. And KJ is now going to take things and kind of unpack things further. What all of this means, how can we apply this thinking and then some, kind of picking up where I left off in terms of understanding a little more on our interpersonal biases and how that can play out in terms of you engaging with your client meaningfully in the way that you want, that aligns with your values. So thank you, and KJ, I'll hand it off to you.
Hello, and welcome to part 2 of Equitable Client Interactions for Pro Bono Lawyering. My name is KJ Williams, and we are just going to dive right in. Omid has already provided us with an overview of key concepts that are related to equity, structural racism, and implicit bias. He's also drawn key connections between structural racism, poverty, and the societal systems needed for health. I'm going to continue on with providing strategies to address personal implicit biases, interacting and responding to microaggressions, and how to practice anti-racism or pro-inclusive behaviors within the context of client representation. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what's called the addressing model. Now, the addressing model, if you look at the spelling, this is not a typo. The letters of addressing correlate with or represent particular characteristics that are listed here within the framework of the body that's outlined here. So we're looking at age, disability, religious culture, ethnicity, sexual orientation, social class culture, indigenous heritage, national origin, and gender. And so one of the things that we want to point out is that the addressing model really stands for these social ranks, right? These letters are representing a social rank. And this social rank is the US rank machine. These are identities that are socially ascribed to us. Now, there are 9 different categories, and this model has been developed by Pamela Hayes, and it's also been used quite extensively by Dr. Leticia Nieto. And you can find her analysis of this model and some amendments to the model within her book, Beyond Empowerment, Beyond Inclusion. So the addressing model is something that we use to reflect on our lived experience of both privilege and marginalized identities. Now here is the model itself. So you'll see that the first category, the first column is though it lists those identities under social rank. And the middle column is what we call agent rank. And then the last column is the target rank. So when we're talking about agent and target, what we're looking at are these identities located in the middle rank, in the center column, sorry about that. These identities that have privilege, that experience very little, if any, barriers to access and opportunities. And so you can read through that yourself and just notice how we have determined socially and politically what identities have privilege and which identities don't. And so when we're talking about that target rank, we're looking at those people and populations in communities that are underrepresented, that are marginalized, and that have experienced historical oppression. So one of the things that I would like for you to do is to take a moment and in looking at this addressing model, and you should have this as part of your materials, take a look, and I'd like for you to answer these questions. So look at each row and figure out which category applies to you, and then answer the following questions. What do you notice about your chart? Is there anything surprising? How many agent identities do you have? How many target identities do you have? Are there any identities that you have that may fall into the target rank, but because of the way that you present, you may be able to hide those identities? These are things that are important to consider, especially when you are examining what the best strategy is in building relationships cross-culturally, in building relationships with people who are very different from you. One of the things that I want to point out is that although sometimes we can hide our identities, there are many identities that we can't hide. And so we don't have the opportunity to access more privileged ways of being or existing in the world because we simply can't hide certain characteristics of our identity. For instance, I am African American, and I am a female, and I am also queer. I also have a disability that is easy to hide. And so if I meet you for the first time as an attorney and I am your client, because I don't know you, I may be trying to figure out which of my identities can I hide so that I can lessen the barriers, so that I can mitigate some of the harm harm that I am expecting to experience because of my marginalized identities. And so I can hide that I'm queer. I don't have to tell you that. I don't have to share any of that information with you. I can also hide my disability to a certain degree. And if I'm able to do that, then I feel like maybe I have a lot more freedom, or a little more freedom, to navigate whatever the social or community space is that I'm in, or to navigate the professional space and to access certain opportunities. And so it's really important to think about your own identities and reflect on how you can actually use your identities to benefit your client, and not just from the standpoint of actually winning the case, right? But from the perspective of considering what is it about who I am and how I navigate the world, how I exist in the world, how I express myself, or how my identity is expressed. How can I use that to build a deeper, trusting, more authentic connection with my client? That is going to be a benefit, right? So take some time to think about this for a few moments, and go through the chart and just note which one of, where you fall at. And recognizing also that with the identities that I'm listing, I am a female, and I may be, let's say that I'm with a colleague who is a female as well, but she is a white female, and perhaps she and I are going into a meeting together with a new supervisor, and we don't really know anything about this supervisor. But as we go in and we start our dialogue, we are having a great time. It seems like everyone is connecting, and he is, and I'm making the supervisor a male, and he seems to be very open and very supportive of women in the workplace, and supporting women advancing their careers, and he is openly and intentionally communicating his support of women. And so both of us are females, and so we seem to be getting the same type of treatment. And he also talks about how supportive he is of Black Lives Matters, and he talks about the work that he's done and the work that the organization has done and where he sees the organization heading. And so I feel really great. And then he begins to talk about his family, and he asked both of us about our family. And so then my colleague begins to share her, some tidbits of information about her family and her husband and their children. And I begin to share about my wife and about my children. And then I sense just a very slight change in the atmosphere. Now, what's important here is to recognize that the more of our identities that we share that fall within the target range, that marginalized area, the identities that experience more oppression and exclusion, the more that I begin to unpack each layer of my identity, that increases the likelihood of the barriers that I will experience and the harm that I may experience in response to that. And what we call this is like, these are compounding biases. So, if the supervisor is fine with the fact that we're both female, I'm fine with the fact that I am a person of color, that I'm Black. And when I say fine, I mean, supportive, advocate, ally, accomplice, all of those good things. But as soon as I add in that I'm queer, then that his bias begins to push to the surface. And then as the dialogue continues, I also inadvertently reveal that I have some level of a disability. And so that bias then begins to compound the bias that's already been surfaced. And so all of these intersecting identities, and the more of those intersecting identities that we have that fall in the target range, leave us exposed and vulnerable to experiencing a greater rate or more biases. All right, so you want to think about that as you are considering building your relationship with your clients. And so now we're going to talk about racial anxiety and stereotype threat. So because these are other racial dynamics at work. And so racial anxiety, when we're talking about this, what we're referring to is the discomfort about the experience and potential consequences of interracial interactions. For instance, people of color may actually experience racial anxiety that they will be the target of discrimination and hostile or distant treatment. And considering the twin pandemics that we've talked about earlier, that the twin pandemics being both COVID-19 as well as the increased violence against Black and brown bodies, you can imagine that the racial anxiety for people of color is perhaps through the roof right now. And when we consider racial anxiety, we can also take a look at the fact that white people tend to experience anxiety, assuming that they will be seen as racist and that they're automatically going to be distrusted and that they're going to experience hostility because they are assumed to be racist. And, this is the reality of the state that we're in right now. And so it's incredibly important to remember that these things are always at play, and given our social and political context, these experiences are going to be exacerbated by the context that we find ourselves in. So when we're talking about stereotype threat, what we're referring to is the pressure that people feel when they fear that their performance may confirm a negative stereotype about their group, right? And so think about all the negative stereotypes that are associated with people of color. You can also think about what it means in terms of that stereotype threat for white people as well, not just those that are marginalized, but there's the stereotypes that we hold about white people as well. And so stereotype threat just means that we're experiencing this increased pressure that whatever we do, whatever language we use, whatever behavior we engage in, however we present ourselves, that we are going to inadvertently fulfill a negative stereotype that has been associated with the group that we identify with. And that creates a level of stress that makes it very difficult to connect with other people. And so considering these two experiences in the context of client interaction is really helpful for you in terms of strategizing on how to navigate this type of experience. And if it surfaces within the context of your client interaction, we're going to give you some strategies to know how to interrupt during that time and get back on track so that you can be aligned. All right, and just the final note on this is just to remember that COVID-19, again, it just increases these pressures. And so what does it mean for us to currently live in a state of high stress, which many of us are? And so for you as an attorney, as someone who has made the decision that you want to engage in pro bono activities, and so you don't know who your client is, you don't know who's going to be assigned to you, right? And so this is going to be a new situation. And so for those of you that have been practicing law for years and have volunteered your pro bono services for years, this may not, you may already have the skill set necessary in order to navigate new, difficult, and challenging experiences. But for those that don't, it's really important to be aware of who you are and how your own body actually responds to new situations, to conflict, to difficult conversations, to stressful situations, so that you can do the work necessary to prepare yourself beforehand in case you run into any of these issues while engaging with pro bono services. And so think about our brain, right? Our brain, the amygdala, it senses our fear and our anxiety. And then our sympathetic nervous system activates, it lights up, and it tells our body what to do in response to the fear and anxiety that we are experiencing. And so some of you may be in that fight mode where instead of disengaging, you want to engage more. That is the way that you are wired. Like, let's engage and let's get through this and let's deal with this right here and right now. For others, it's the flight mode. Oh my God, there's too much going on. My anxiety is through the roof. I'm stressed and my body is telling me to get the heck out. And so you're running for the hills. Some of us engage stress and anxiety by freezing. Our brains flood and we can't think, and it's difficult for us to process, and so we just freeze up. For others, it is we fall into this appeasing mode. Let me just do what I can to stop the conflict. Let me just give you what I need to give you, say what I need to say to you, respond with a particular body language, anything to help calm the situation and to appease the other party so that the conflict can be cleared. And then for others, it's this sense of dissociation. And that is like this ability to not just compartmentalize, but to disconnect. And you may still be in dialogue, but you have disconnected your emotions. You have disconnected yourself from the impact, from the emotional, physical impact of a conflict, of the fear, of the anxiety that's taking place and unfolding with you right there in the midst. And so it's important to know what your response is, because all of these responses make it very difficult for us to actually actively listen and to do any logical reasoning. And so it's important to figure out what strategies do I need to employ if I am faced with any level of conflict, stress, or anxiety in engaging with my client, so that, again, we can be reconnected and we can realign and move forward. All right. So right now, given the context that we're living in, clients are in crisis. But this is what I like to remind attorneys and legal professionals about, that while you're working hard to show up and to provide support and to advocate on behalf of your clients, you also are in crisis. Now, your crisis may not be the same crisis as your client. Maybe you're not worried about where you're going to live or how you're going to pay your rent, or if you have to go to the food bank, or if your family member is sick. But we're all being directly and indirectly impacted by the twin pandemics because of the messages, because of the narratives, because of all the information that we're getting on a daily basis, both information to help us stay safe, but also information to inform us of where it's not safe and who's not safe, right? And so these types of experiences are happening on a regular basis. And the more places of stress that we have in our lives, the more strongly we are going to respond to the stress of this particular crisis. So these are compounding forms of oppression for individuals with multiple target identities, right? And so, and not just, I point out that if you already have target identities, and then on top of that, you are dealing with any of these situations listed in the next two slides in these bullet points, then this is going to increase the stress that you are navigating. This is going to increase the stress that your clients are navigating. And it's important for you to hold that space, that knowledge, so that you can prepare yourself for the type of interaction or the possible interactions that you may have with clients that are really stress fueled, and so that you can respond in a way that is not reactive. All right. And so just some of these bullet points, I'll give you a moment to read through these. I give you a moment to just kind of think through the clients that you've already engaged with. How many of them have already identified that they are dealing with many of these bullet points? And in light of that, if they are holding those multiple target identities, then their stress is going through the roof, right? All right, so we're going to go to the next slide, where this just shows us some more situations that your clients and that yourself may be navigating right now. All right. Okay. So now we are going to move on to the ladder of inference. Now I have a video for you to watch here. I am hoping that this video will work for us so that I can go ahead and play this for you. The ladder of inference is really great because it takes us through a process where we can actually evaluate, and we can do this in hindsight as well, we can evaluate how we are having our conversations and the conclusions and assumptions that we're making by just picking out certain pieces of data that stand out to us and what those data mean in light of our lived experience and how we make assumptions and then come to conclusions and operate out of those things within the context of our interpersonal engagement. And so just thinking back on conversations that you've had and thinking forward about, these new conversations, these new interactions that you're going to have with clients, and really helping yourself to slow down so that you can think more clearly and that you can actively listen so that you're actually staying aligned throughout the conversation with your client. And by aligned, I just mean you're staying present, right? You're staying present and you're not making these assumptions that are causing you to jump ahead and engage in behaviors that will turn out to be detrimental. So let's see if this video is going to run for us.
Hi, I'm Edward Musio, CEO of Group Harmonics, and I'm going to tell you how the ladder of inference creates bad judgment. Have you ever gotten yourself in trouble by jumping to conclusions based upon what you saw in someone else's behavior? It happens more often than many of us realize. As a way of explaining this, Harvard business professor Chris Argyris defined what he called the ladder of inference, a set of 6 rungs on a metaphorical ladder that we climb to get from what we see to what we believe and what we do about it. Down here on the bottom rung is the first level. This is called observable data. Observable data is everything we might capture in a situation if we're capturing it with a camera. So let's say you're at a staff meeting with 5 of your employees. One of them is giving a presentation, pointing at the board. One of them is shifting in her chair, checking her BlackBerry. One of them is taking notes, etc. All of that is observable data. From there, you move to the next rung, which is selected data. It's too much data to process, so you select some of that data and you ignore the rest. Let's say you choose to focus in on the employee who's shifting in her chair, checking her watch, and checking her BlackBerry. From there, you move to the next rung, which is assumptions. Assumptions are where you start to add meaning. You might look at her and say, she seems uncomfortable. From there, you move to conclusions, the next rung. You might say, I think she's uncomfortable because there's something she doesn't want to say or doesn't want to share. Now, if you see that behavior a couple times, you might go to the next level, which is beliefs. Beliefs are what you come to think about the situation. You might come to believe that this employee doesn't share forthrightly when she has something to say. And if you believe that, you'll probably take action. You'll probably go off and do something, like start to ask her more questions directly to elicit those things she's just not saying. Now, why does this create bad judgment? The problem is there are 2 recursive loops here. The first one is from beliefs down to selected data. Our beliefs lead us to choices about which data we select. If you think this employee is untrustworthy, you're going to look at the data that proves it to you. You're going to ignore the data that doesn't. That's a recursive loop. The second loop goes from actions down to observable data. The actions you take, like asking her more questions in staff meetings, lead to situations, like chances for her to get uncomfortable, which lead you to more observable data in which she looks uncomfortable. Obviously, what you want to do is get in the habit of moving down the ladder. To do this, there are 2 simple rules. First, question your assumptions and your conclusions. So if you're seeing something in this employee that you've come to an assumption or a conclusion that she doesn't want to share something, ask yourself, what else could be going on? What data did I select? What data did I avoid? What else might have been going on that I couldn't see at all? Seek contrary data, even if you have to make it up. For example, maybe she was looking at her BlackBerry and checking her clock because she had an important deadline on another project that's even more important to the company than yours. Maybe it had nothing to do with you at all. There's nothing wrong with starting with observable data and drawing conclusions. You have to do that, but you don't want to get caught in recursive loops where the actions you're taking are based upon your own assumptions and nothing else. So whether it's by yourself or with a trusted colleague, get in the habit of questioning your assumptions. When you do, you'll be less likely to make bad judgments.
All right, that's awesome. So Remember, get in the habit of questioning your assumptions, and you will be less likely to make bad judgments. And we all make assumptions. This is what we do as humans, right? And we make those assumptions very, very quickly. And so this is why it's important to increase our own self-awareness and our consciousness so that we can be fully present and stop ourselves when we when we recognize that we're in the process of making assumptions with very little information. All right, so here's another exercise for you. What I'd like for you to do is to think of a client or peer interaction that was difficult, uncomfortable, or a new, different type of engagement, which caused you to question your assumptions. And answer the following questions. Using the ladder of inference, identify where you could have or wish you had made a different choice on how to engage or communicate. In retrospect, what would you have changed or modified during the interaction? And what did you learn that can be applied to your work with clients today? So make some time to think back on recent interactions, both those that were just slightly uncomfortable and those that actually didn't go very well at all. And do that within the comfort and the privacy of your own home. Talk out loud to yourself. Ask yourself hard questions. Push back against yourself, right? Because, we inherently want to make ourselves feel better, and we want to believe that we are showing up and being our best selves when we are engaging with clients. But it's just not always true. But in order for us to get to that place where we are doing that more often than not, it really requires us to question our own assumptions about ourselves first, and to really push ourselves to see beyond, and through our rosy glasses when we're considering who we are, how we show up, and the behaviors and language that we use when we're engaging with our clients. Okay. So what can we do when we are faced with a situation where it's a new situation, or we're dealing with a client where things have gotten off on a rocky start, or we are already in the midst of some conflict, right? We find ourselves in the midst of conflict before we even know it. Well, one of the first things we want to do is to pause, to slow down, to actually stop if we can. And we almost always can do it. We just have been socialized to be uncomfortable stopping things when we are in a public setting, or stopping a dialogue because we are uncomfortable. And especially women. Women have been socialized in a way that causes us to stay connected in conversations and in dialogue, even when it's become unhealthy, because we're socialized to be caretakers and to be nurturing, and we're socialized around these personal connections and interactions. And I want to push back on that, because I want you to remember that first and foremost, if you can't take care of yourself, male or female or transgender, recognize that then you're not going to be able to show up well for anyone else. Okay. And so, and I'm sorry, I did not list all of the gender options, but I'm trying to be as inclusive as I can, in recognizing that we do not live in a binary, or we do live in a binary society, but that binary framework does not work for many of us, if not the majority of us, right? And so I just want to make that point there. So pause, slow down, and reflect. And I'm going to give you some strategies later on language that you can do, language that you can employ to actually make the slowdown happen. Cultivate self-awareness. I talked about this earlier. I mean, recognize that we all have a cultural experience, our own backgrounds, and our own assumptions and our own biases. And these things are based on our lived experience. They're neither right nor wrong. They are just the totality that has made us who we are, and that informs the way that we engage and navigate the environment. And so remembering what, cultivating self-awareness around your own background, experiences, beliefs, and assumptions is critically important, but also holding space to recognize that the client's background, experience, beliefs, and assumptions may be grossly different than yours, right? And so because of that difference, there's already this opportunity for misunderstandings and misinterpretations. And this is another reason why pausing and slowing down and taking time to reflect and taking time to actually repeat back what you believe you heard your client say is really important. And then understanding the context, right? And we talked about that. We are in a twin pandemic, and that larger macro context is informing quite a bit. And then as you drill down, the context can become even more stressful, right? Go back to those 2 slides and look at the list of situations and experiences that your client and yourself may be navigating. And so understanding that you're operating within a layered context that currently is filled with increased opportunities for anxiety and stress to be played out. All right, so moving right along here. Now, how do we get to this place where we are in a state where we have an increased awareness and we're able to acknowledge what our biases are and able to pay like intentional attention to those things? Well, what we're going to have to do is understand where it all begins. And this goes back to the schemas that Omid talked about earlier. And just, we have all different schemas, all different types of schemas that are going on in our mind that have taught us who to connect with and what meaning this particular person has for us and what meaning this particular activity has for us. And so part of what needs to take place is a reconditioning process. And I say these cultural bridges, right? And cultural bridges, because when we are faced with a client who is very different from us, what we do know is that we have been socialized in a particular way, and so have they. And we also know that we're all maybe experiencing some level of racial anxiety and stereotype threat. All of these things are playing out internally for us, right? And so it's important for us to recondition our brain, recondition our way of being away from those biases that we've been socialized into. And so how do we do that? We've got to engage in strategies that raise our awareness, raise our consciousness. So it goes back to really taking the time to know who we are. What is your communication style? What is your conflict management style? How does your body respond to conflict? What are the biases that you hold? Take the Harvard Implicit Association test as a strategy for laying the groundwork to learn more about your biases, so that then you can engage in strategies to reduce or mitigate how those biases get played out against other people, especially those people who are represented, or groups, especially those groups or people represented by your clients, okay? And then just acknowledge the fact that you have these biases. We all have biases. It doesn't matter who we are. We have negative and positive biases, but those biases are influencing and impacting our everyday lives. And then paying intentional attention to not just our biases, but what's happening to our bodies physiologically. So when we are faced with a new situation, when we are meeting a new person, when we're engaging with a new client, pay attention to what's happening to your physiological self, right? Has your heartbeat increased? Are you sweating? Are your hands clammy? Are you shaking? Do you feel very nervous? Is your mouth dry? Has your stomach tightened? Is your knee shaking? Right? Your body begins to talk to you. Has your brain gone blank, or has your mind gone blank? Like, your body is talking to you. Pay intentional attention to what's happening to you physiologically, and then pay intentional attention attention to your thoughts that you're having, right? As when the stereotypes start coming up, because I've walked in the room and I may have decided that this is the day that I'm going to wear a head wrap, right? What particular images come up for you? What fears come up for you? What anxiety comes up for you? And what stereotypes are those things attached to? Pay intentional attention to how your thoughts are being influenced by stereotypes, and your own biases, and how that can influence the language that you choose to use, the body language that you engage in, and the behaviors that you are interacting with your clients with. All right, so we're going to move on to client interviewing. So, if you were meeting in person with your clients, and I don't know when we're going to get to that place, given the phases and all the things that are taking place right now, but I'm going to talk just a moment about the physical environment for the day that we do return to being able to meet and connect with one another in shared spaces, right, without the 6 feet safety net that we are currently employing. So think about your physical environment. Is it a shared space, or is it a space that you have created just for you? So, when your client walks into the space, whether it's the interview room or it is the reception area, is it a welcoming area? Are there any type of indicators that would say to a client who has multiple target identities, your business is not only welcomed here, you are welcomed here. And not only are you welcomed here, we want you to be comfortable here. We want to reflect that you are accepted, right? Because people of color have learned how to look for those visual cues as to whether or not they are going to be received well. I do this all the time. I walk into a place of business and I automatically am looking for images of other people of color. I'm looking for staff that reflect other people of color. I look at the furniture as well. When you have furniture that is very stiff and that doesn't provide any opportunity for you to relax your body, and I don't mean like laying down on the sofa, but to actually be relaxed, what that is communicating to me is you don't want me to be comfortable. You want me to recognize that I am here specifically to sit in this seat for a quick second, and then perhaps you will take me back to the back. Or if I'm going to be there for an extended period of time, you don't want me to get too comfortable. And we could, there is an effort to really look at how we design our spaces and what we're communicating through the design of our spaces. And so I encourage you to do that. But now we're in a place during the twin pandemics when the majority of us are actually working remotely. And so if we're working remotely, what are the types of strategies that we can use in order to create a more shared space, right? How do we build those remote relationships or virtual relationships in a way that allows for productive client interviewing? All right. So one of the things that we can do, and you can look for this up, you can look this up. I believe it is Harvard Business Review. And I love this because I talk about Swift Trust. So with Swift Trust, you automatically have this opportunity to build to have a great start to building a trusting and authentic relationship with your client. Because when we're talking about Swift Trust, what we're talking about is a space that hasn't been cluttered yet with our stereotypes, with our biases, with our thoughts, with our behaviors. We have, I don't know you, I'm a client and you're the attorney and we haven't met yet, but now we're gonna meet. And the first time we meet, we're meeting on Zoom. And so within those first you know, within that first minute, you as the attorney have this incredible opportunity to increase trust. And the way that you do that is like, I'm already giving you the benefit of the doubt, and you can give me the benefit of the doubt as well, right? We know that as soon as we see each other, our minds are probably going to be flooded with stereotypes and our biases and our thoughts and our lived experience and who we remind one another of. But if we can stop that and not give in to beginning to actually dwell on those thoughts, then we have this opportunity to give one another the benefit of the doubt. We already have a positive atmosphere because it's not been cluttered with any of these things, and we get to leverage this. You get to leverage this as an attorney. In this process, you know, we've got to look for opportunities to increase the interpersonal trust. So we have that benefit of the doubt right out the gate. And then what do we do? That next step, even through Zoom, you can think through, now you'll have information about your client. And I know that that information can vary depending upon what the method of intake is and the information that you need for the case. But, you know, there are times when you may not have a lot of information about your client. And this is when you're looking to gain more depth of understanding about who your client is and what they're navigating. And so this is where you get to build that interpersonal trust. You get to connect on personal details. So you'll have to determine which personal details are appropriate for you to speak on. I know that in all of the Zoom meetings that I am facilitating and being a part of nowadays, one of the things that I do is, you know, on Zoom, depending upon where people are locating themselves within their house, they usually are trying to find great backgrounds. I find something authentic. I'm not going to make up anything. So we want to find something that's authentic and genuinely of interest to us, right? So, wow, that's a beautiful painting behind you. Like, does that represent something? The colors are amazing. Oh, I see you have pictures up of your family. That's great. Tell me some things about your children. I have children too. You know, you find, oh, I see that you have a picture of sailing or rowing or kayaking or camping. I personally love camping, so and that's a new sport for me. So I would be really excited and I would engage in some short dialogue, right? And that helps to build that interpersonal trust. It communicates that you're interested in them as a person. And then predictability. What do we mean when we're talking about predictability? Well, like, ultimately, what we're doing is creating a experience of consistency. The client who understands what the interview process means, what it looks like, and what meeting with you is going to look like moving forward is a client who can take a deep breath and relax, right? It's not going to be something new each and every time they meet with you. And so one of the ways that you can do this is you can send a short agenda to your client to say, okay, we're scheduled to meet at this time. Here's what you can expect during this meeting. And if you know that you're going to have a series of, let's say, 2 or 3 meetings with this client, here are elements that are going to be present in each and every meeting. Now, keep in mind that I recognize that not every meeting is going to be duplicative of the prior meeting, nor should it be. But there are wherever you can employ consistency in the meeting, like we're meeting at 10 o'clock every Tuesday or something like that, or our meetings are 30 minutes long, and never go over that time unless you have express permission from the client. But be careful, because if you're asking the question, your positionality and your power are going to inform the client's willingness and feeling like they are able to actually push back and say, no, I can't go over this time. But ultimately, what we want to look at is the consistency that you want to create for your clients. And so And then going back to sharing and rotating, I'm going on to sharing and rotating power. So remind the client that you are representing them, but ultimately this is their life and they have the power and the right to disagree and to ask questions of you. And refrain from defensiveness if a client is asking you multiple questions. I know that sometimes for some attorneys, being questioned by their client can be very difficult because it may suggest that the client doesn't trust them. But if we consider that larger context that we operating in, if we also consider the fact that we go back to the target and agent identities, going back to the addressing model, one of the things that that I should have pointed out at the beginning is, if you think about the legal profession itself, this is a agent profession, right? When we're talking about our essential workers, for most of them, we're talking about target professions, right? We're not talking about those professions where they are making exorbitant amounts of money now, and outside of the healthcare industry, all right? But even with the healthcare industry, when we're talking about essential workers, the majority of essential workers, they're not the doctors and they're actually not the nurses. They're all of the support staff, right? And so think about what it means positionally for you as an attorney during this time. You are still a member of a very elite profession, okay? And so the power that you have even in asking a question means something. It has an impact. But reminding your client and then modeling for them that that you actually support what you're saying, right? That this is aligned with who you are, that what you say and what you do are aligned, that you are congruent, can be done by you stopping periodically and authentically asking your client for their feedback and for their input. How do you feel about this decision? How do you feel about moving forward this way? What are your thoughts about taking this particular approach? What are your thoughts about this particular strategy? Okay. And then now moving on to client interaction. So this is an exercise where you can list 6 actions that you can take to facilitate an inclusive client interview process. All right. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to think about that. So I would love for you to just list 6 actions right now that you can take to facilitate an inclusive client interview process. Okay, so that wasn't quite 2 minutes, but I am going to list some actions that you can actually take to facilitate an inclusive client interview process. Number 1, you can cultivate self-awareness. Number 2, pause, slow down, reflect. Number 3, don't make assumptions, understand the context that you are operating in. Number 4, understand how you personally navigate conflict and difference. Number 5, engage empathetically. Number 6, active listening. Remember, be present. Don't take, while your client is speaking, is not the time for you to be formulating in your mind what your response is going to be. Excuse me, it looks like I have the hiccups that have just started. Number 7, understand and use the power of questioning. And I know as an attorney that this is a strength that you have, this ability to question, right? Because you've got to get to the information that you really need. All right, and then number 8, become skilled at identifying the need for and utilizing interpreters. And by interpreters, I'm not only talking about about language interpreters, like sign language or English as a second language interpreters. I mean, recognizing that when there are opportunities, if you have a client who is finding it very difficult to articulate what their problems or their needs are, ask them if there is a family member that they trust that they would like to bring with them to help them communicate what their needs are, right? And as an attorney, you know the lines that you need to hold in terms of confidentiality. But if you really want to be, if you really want to create an inclusive process, then we've got to think beyond the current state that we're in and our old way of doing things, and recognize that because of the increased stress and anxiety, that it often makes it very difficult for people to think clearly, and that they are often better able to do that when they have someone present with them that they trust, because you hold the power. For most Americans, for the average American coming in to a relationship with an attorney, they automatically assume that the attorney has all the information, has all the knowledge, knows everything that needs to be done, and so they operate from this more disempowered place. And so you want to empower them, right? And so that those are some of the actions that you can engage in. Now, what happens when you are in the midst of this interaction with your client? And in fact, there is some conflict that ensues, that maybe you made a statement that hit them the wrong way, and that they find insulting or disrespectful, or you feel that way as well, right? That they've said something to you. So how do we get to a place where we can rebound from the mistakes that we make? And what kind of form do those mistakes take? So we're going to talk about microaggressions really briefly. What are microaggressions? They're brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial, gender, sexual orientation, and religious slights and insults to the target person or group. And there are three types of microaggressions: the microassault, the microinvalidation, and the microinsult. Now, when we are talking about the microassault, this is the microaggression that is the closest to no longer being a microaggression and just being all out aggressive behavior. Okay, so some examples of a microaggression, of a microassault would be like an able-bodied person kicks a cane out of a disabled person's hand, or a man groping a female and laughing about it, or someone shouting a slur at a person of color. And so, these are examples of a microassault. When we're talking about a microinvalidation, we're talking about the type of verbal engagement that actually causes self-doubt, causes doubt in another person. And so that the kind of response that can do that would be like, I'm coming to you and saying, hey, I really feel like this interaction that I just had with my supervisor had something to do with the fact that I'm queer, and that I'm Black. And you say in response, well, I've never had a problem with her or him, and I think you're just being too sensitive, or like, are you sure you're not imagining things? Or even making the comment that you can't find qualified POC for a position, and that's why the staff are all white, right? That's a microinvalidation. And pull yourself up from your bootstraps, another microinvalidation, as though we're not all working to better our lives. So when we're talking about a micro insult, with the micro insult, we are actually, I'm just going to give you an example, and I think this example, because it's an insult, and so this example, I think, is it just speaks volumes. This is when current president-elect, I think that's the right terminology, Joe Biden, is commenting on President Obama and says he's the first Black person articulate enough to be a front runner for president, right? The first, I mean, how insulting is that? That's an example of a micro insult. And then a couple other examples are talking to a person in a wheelchair as though they are a child. Males calling women sweetie and honey in a professional context. And when a straight person calls something gay, when they really mean it's stupid, right? And so one of the things we want to remember is that microaggressions really serve to put victims in a place where they feel pressure to stay silent and ignore what's happened. And we want to mitigate and eliminate these as much as possible. But what happens if you or your client actually engage in some form of these behaviors? How do you recover from that? So what we're going to look at now is, I'm just trying to straighten this out a little bit, is how to interrupt the expression of a microaggression. So one of the first things that you need to remember is that intent does not always equal impact. That though when you made your statement, you had one intention, and that intention was not a negative one. It wasn't to cause harm. It was not to facilitate any form of trauma. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. And so then what do you do when that happens? Well, recognize that because your intent was one thing and your impact was had another outcome, that you're going to have to pause and slow down and take a deep breath, because automatically one of the things we want to do is to defend ourselves. We want to say, I didn't mean that. No, that's not exactly what I said. But rarely is the other person who's been impacted, rarely are they able to hear that in the moment. So we need to stop and we need to slow down. And let's clarify some things. Let's clarify the issue and make sure that we're both referring to the same topic, issue, or point. And we can do that by asking certain questions. And I have a list, just a short representative list of questions that you can use to interrupt and start that clarifying process. What did you mean when you said? And did I understand you when you said? Did I hear you correctly? Or tell me more about what you mean. Tell me more about what you're saying. Tell me more about that comment, right? And then we also have this opportunity when clarifying to learn more about ourselves and to learn more about our client. Let's understand where the other person is coming from. Like, why do you think this is the case? What do you think would happen if, X, Y, and Z? And how did you determine that, I am this kind of person? Or how did you conclude that I felt this kind of way about you? So this will help to give you more insight as to the inner workings, like the impetus, the lived experience of your client or your colleague or whoever this other person is. And if you're asking yourself those questions as well, then you learn more about yourself. And then when we get to the place, like really we want to respond, but we need to find a way to interrupt this negative trajectory of the dialogue by creating the opportunity to think and breathe. And you have to make the choice to empower yourself to say, I would like to slow this conversation down. Can I suggest we take a break for X amount of time and come back to the conversation? And I think we should take a different approach to this conversation and let's try again. Right? So these are some strategies that you can employ to help interrupt when things begin to get sticky, when they start getting hard. I would encourage you to interrupt a dialogue as soon as you begin to feel uncomfortable or as soon as you begin to sense that your client is uncomfortable. Don't wait for it to play itself out. Don't give space for things to be buried, because the risk just goes up exponentially when we allow things to be buried, because eventually they're going to come out. And when they come out, because they've been suppressed, the impact is always greater, bigger, deeper. All right, so Now we're just about to the end here. We have one more slide after this one. What do we do if we're the person who is engaged in microaggressive behavior or language? How do we respond to being interrupted? Well, first, we need to refrain from defensiveness, right? Just as much as you possibly can, refrain from defensiveness. And one of the things to do is to pause, to stop, to slow down, and to ask for space. I need time to think. And part of that is to allow your body to return to its normal, to a more normalized state of being, right? Because as soon as we're in conflict, the amygdala is speaking, fear and anxiety is running rampant, and then we have our physiological response. We're being pummeled in our mind with all the stereotypes, and we have all of these things that are working to keep us engaged in a heightened state of being. So we want to disconnect, and that will allow us to breathe deep and will give us the space to engage with less defensiveness or no defensiveness at all, where we can begin to use those questions so that we can get to the place of clarification, learning, and then responding in a way that is really healthy, right? I talked about resisting the urge to explain your intent. I talked about like really active listening. Choose to listen openly about the impact that your words or behaviors have had. And that doesn't mean that you're agreeing with it. It means that you are actually engaging in healthy dialogue where you're giving the other person the opportunity to speak. Don't interrupt. Let them speak, all right? And then take responsibility for what you can take responsibility for. I would recommend that you don't use language like, I'm sorry you feel like I didn't treat you with respect, because that is a micro insult. It is a micro insult and it is a micro invalidation. And so now you've just made things even worse, right? So really take responsibility for those things that you can. And that may mean that you need to take time so that you can actually see yourself through a clearer lens, because remember what I said earlier, we inherently want to see ourselves as good people, and we almost always want to defend our behavior and our actions and our language in a way that sets us up as being the good person, right? So then engaging by asking what the best course of action is. So what do we need to do next? What do I need to do next? And being ready to actually listen and to respond and take action on what recommendations that you've been given. And then forgive yourself and move on. We're humans. It's going to happen again. We have more than enough time and space necessary to stick our foot in it again, right? And so the more that we can engage in these restorative, reconciliating behaviors, the better at navigating difficult conversations, difficult situations, and just hard places we will become. And then give space for the other person to fully share their experience and resist the desire to try and explain away your behavior, because that's really projecting it on to either the other person or to some extenuating or external circumstance. But in that moment, your client or your colleague or your friend or your family member, they don't want to hear that. They want you to take full responsibility, because it is you that is connected to them. It is you that is fully present with them now. And so our last and final slide is, lay claim to being the kind of person that is focused on restoration and reconciliation, right? That you are not only engaging in anti-racist behaviors, but you are engaging in pro-inclusive behaviors. That's a phrase that I've just started using because, we take this approach of being anti, right? Being against something. And I think that that's great. And that can be very positive, but it's even more powerful to take a stance where we are pro something. We are for something. I am for inclusion. I am pro-inclusion. And so what do you do first? Center yourself. You're not being attacked, right? It may feel like it, but recognize that within the context of conflict, that we are both still individuals. And I am playing out whatever I'm playing out based on myself, based on what I've perceived about you, but that perception is still about me, all right? And then listen, don't interrupt or think about ways to defend yourself. Acknowledge and apologize, and then inquire. This goes back to asking those questions and moving forward, right? You can apologize, but really engage in behaviors that are transforming the way that you navigate your space and navigate your relationships. So I want to say thank you very much for being present. I hope that you enjoyed this part of the presentation. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me at Just Lead, and you have my contact information. Again, this is KJ Williams, Leadership and Equity Consultant with Just Lead Washington, also owner and founder of Rise with KJ. Thank you very much, and have a fantastic day.